The evening was settling in quietly, but something about the air inside the house felt different. A low hum buzzed through the walls, an unspoken tension that had been building for weeks, perhaps months. Thomas sat at the kitchen counter, absently slicing vegetables for dinner, but his mind wasn't on the meal. His thoughts kept drifting back to Emily, his wife, Sarah's stepmother. She was out shopping, as she often was on Saturdays. Thomas didn't mind. It gave him time to himself, a small respite from the constant pull of balancing his new marriage with raising a daughter who seemed to be slipping further away with every passing day. His daughter, Sarah, had been different ever since they'd moved into the new house. At first, it had been subtle. She didn't want to eat her meals with them. She would stay in her room for hours on end, her door shut tight. When Thomas asked her what was wrong, she simply shrugged or said, "I'm fine, Dad." But he knew better. He had tried to address it with Emily, who assured him that Sarah just needed time to adjust. "She's just grieving, Tom," Emily had said, her voice warm and understanding. "She'll come around." But Sarah hadn't come around. And now, every time Thomas looked at her, he saw something in her eyes, something he couldn't quite place, but it made his stomach churn. It was a kind of fear, a quiet, reserved terror that had crept into her once bright demeanor. Thomas had noticed the bruises too, small ones. At first, they were easy to dismiss. A scrape here or there, a mark on her wrist. He had told himself they were from playing or accidents. But the more he looked, the more he couldn't ignore the fact that they were on places that didn't make sense. On her arms, on her legs, on her ribs. He had asked her about them once. "Did you fall, Sarah?" he had asked gently, his voice soft, trying not to sound accusing. She had only shrugged, a hollow expression crossing her face. "I'm fine, Dad. Really." But tonight, as the clock ticked closer to dinner time and the house felt quieter than usual, Thomas had the strange, almost unbearable sense that something was about to break. Sarah was sitting on the couch in the living room, her tiny form huddled in the corner, a stuffed bear clutched tightly to her chest. Her wide, brown eyes flicked nervously toward the front door as if expecting something, to arrive. Thomas dried his hands on the dish towel and stood up, sensing that the unease in the air wasn't just his own. "Hey, kiddo," he called gently. As he walked into the living room, he sat beside her on the couch, but she didn't look at him. Her head was down, her hair spilling over her face like a curtain, hiding whatever emotion was brewing beneath. He leaned in closer, his voice softening. "What's wrong? You've been so quiet lately." For a long moment, Sarah didn't respond. Thomas could feel the weight of her silence pressing down on him, thick and uncomfortable. He wondered if she would ever truly open up to him again. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I need to tell you something, Dad." Thomas felt his heart tighten. "What is it, sweetheart?" He turned his body toward her, the unease in his chest growing. Sarah swallowed hard, her fingers nervously playing with the hem of her sleeve. She hesitated, glancing at the hallway as if she expected someone to emerge at any moment. She looked small, too small to be carrying the weight of whatever it was she was about to say. I don't want to make trouble, but..." She trailed off. The words seemed stuck, lodged somewhere deep inside her throat. Thomas's breath hitched. He had seen that look before. It was the look of a child who had been forced to hold onto a secret for far too long. "Whatever it is, Sarah, you can tell me. I'm your dad. You know I'll always listen." She looked at him then, and in her eyes, he saw something he hadn't noticed before. A flicker of fear, a flash of something dark and uncertain. His stomach dropped. "It's Emily," she said, her voice barely audible. She hurts me, Dad, when you're not home." Thomas froze. The knife he had been holding in his hand slipped from his grasp and clattered to the floor, but neither of them moved. His pulse thudded in his ears. His breath seemed to catch in his throat. "Hurts you?" The words felt like they were slipping out of him, disbelieving. Sarah nodded, slowly pulling up her sleeve. The skin on her arm was pale, but there were dark purple bruises, finger-shaped indentations on her wrist. There were more marks scattered along her legs, some lighter, others deeper, forming an unmistakable pattern. They were fingerprints, clear, outlined, and angry. "She grabs me, Dad," Sarah whispered. "She hits me when you're not home, and she tells me I'm nothing. She says I'm not her daughter. She calls me a little brat and says I'm ruining everything." The room felt like it was closing in on him, the walls pushing in, the air getting thicker and harder to breathe. Thomas's chest tightened, the shock of her words reverberating through his body. "No, no, sweetheart," he said, shaking his head, as though denying it would somehow make it not true. But he saw the truth in her eyes. He saw the terror in her small, trembling form. Sarah reached for her stuffed bear, her fingers wrapping around it so tightly that her knuckles whitened. "I'm sorry, Dad," she murmured, her voice full of guilt. "I didn't want to tell you. I didn't want to make you hate her." A wave of conflicting emotions surged through Thomas. Anger, disbelief, sadness, guilt. He had been so blind. He had failed her. He had failed to see the bruises, failed to see how she had been slipping away from him. But now, the truth was laid bare in front of him, and he couldn't deny it any longer. He reached for her hand, pulling her gently into his arms. "You didn't do anything wrong, sweetheart. You did the right thing. I'm so sorry I didn't notice. I promise you, I'll fix this. I'll make sure she can't hurt you anymore." Sarah's body shook with the sobs that she had been holding back for so long. "I'm scared, Dad. I don't want her to hurt me anymore." "I'm here now," he said, his voice low and steady, the words coming out with a newfound determination. "You're safe. You're going to be safe from now on." He sat with her for what felt like hours, just holding her, trying to absorb the magnitude of what she had just told him. How had he not seen it before? How had he missed the signs? But all those questions would have to wait. Right now, the only thing that mattered was Sarah. The only thing that mattered was stopping Emily. The evening was still and quiet, but the air felt heavy with the weight of what had just been revealed. The house, once a home, now felt like a place of secrets, lies, and looming danger. But tonight, Sarah had taken the first step toward telling the truth. And tomorrow, Thomas would take the first step toward making sure that truth was never hidden again. The battle had only just begun. The house felt eerily still, as though it were holding its breath. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind through the trees outside, seemed amplified in the thick silence that had settled after Sarah's revelation. Thomas sat in the dimly lit living room, his hands gripping the armrests of the couch, his mind racing. The weight of the night before still pressed heavily on his chest, and he couldn't shake the image of Sarah's bruised arms, her small face filled with fear. He kept replaying her words over and over again in his mind. "She hurts me, Dad, when you're not home." The soft glow of the lamp beside him flickered as the light bulb buzzed. He didn't notice. His thoughts were too loud, too chaotic, a relentless storm. He had failed his daughter. He had let Emily into their lives, and now look what had happened. But Thomas was nothing if not determined. He would fix this. He would make sure Sarah was safe, no matter the cost. But how? His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his spiraling thoughts. It was a message from Sarah. "Can we talk tonight?" His stomach flipped. Even now, hours after their conversation, she was still processing everything. Thomas had barely slept, but he knew he needed to be strong for her. He texted back quickly. "Of course, sweetheart. I'm here." But the moment he hit send, his phone rang. The caller ID showed Emily's name. His heart skipped, but he didn't pick up. He wasn't ready to talk to her. Not yet. Not until he knew exactly what to say. Instead, he stood up, pacing the room, his mind working. He had to confront Emily, but he needed proof. Not just bruises or vague accusations. He needed to see it for himself. He needed to know exactly what was happening when he wasn't there. He had to make sure that when he confronted Emily, he wasn't just reacting on impulse. He needed to be certain, or this whole thing could spiral out of control. Suddenly, it hit him. The idea, the plan. He had to get Sarah to act normal around Emily. He needed her to be brave, to gather enough courage to say the words aloud that Emily couldn't deny. But how could he make sure he was there when it happened? How could he be certain that his daughter would be safe? His eyes landed on the closet in the corner of the living room. It was an odd, small detail, one he hadn't given much thought to since moving in. The closet was a bit too deep, the door a bit too tight, but it was perfect. If he could hide there, unseen, and listen in, maybe even see what was really happening when Emily thought she was alone with Sarah, then he could finally confront the truth head-on. He grabbed his phone and texted Sarah again. "I need your help, okay? I'll explain tonight, but we need to be clever about this." He held his breath as he waited for a response. A part of him feared she would back out, that she would say it was too much. But then, the screen lit up with her reply, "I'm scared, Dad, but I trust you." Thomas's heart swelled with relief. He wasn't going to let his daughter down again. Later that evening, as the clock struck 7 p.m., Emily walked through the door, her laughter echoing from the hallway. The scent of her perfume lingered in the air, an aroma that once reminded Thomas of romance, but now made him uneasy. He glanced at Sarah, who had already taken her seat at the dinner table, her back straight and her eyes focused downward. She didn't look up as Emily entered, a strained silence hanging between them. "Hey, babe," Emily said cheerfully, giving Thomas a quick peck on the cheek as she slipped into her usual seat. But her eyes flitted towards Sarah with a coldness that Thomas couldn't ignore. There was something off about the way Emily spoke to Sarah, like a teacher reprimanding an unruly student. Sarah didn't respond to her stepmother's greeting. Instead, she simply picked at her food, her eyes averted, as if the act of sitting at the table itself was too much. Thomas could see it, could feel it, how Emily's presence filled the room with an oppressive weight. The walls of the house seemed to be closing in on Sarah, and Thomas could feel his chest tightening with each passing second. He forced a smile. "I was thinking, Emily, maybe we should all go out this weekend, get some fresh air, maybe visit that park Sarah loves." He tried to keep his tone casual, but it was impossible to hide the tension in his voice. Emily shrugged nonchalantly. "Sure, whatever. Just let me know." Thomas turned to Sarah, trying to keep the conversation light. "How about you, Sarah? You like that idea?" Sarah nodded without looking up. Emily's eyes darted between them, a hint of annoyance flickering across her face. Thomas felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. There was something in the way Emily looked at Sarah, something that unsettled him as the night wore on. The conversation faded into background noise. But Thomas was acutely aware of the distance between Sarah and Emily, the way his daughter's shoulders seemed to hunch more with every passing minute. The tension was unbearable. He couldn't let this go on any longer, not without knowing what was truly happening when he wasn't there. After dinner, as Emily retreated to the bedroom to change, Thomas turned to Sarah. He pulled her gently aside, away from the prying eyes of Emily. "Listen, sweetheart," he said, his voice hushed. "I'm going to need you to help me with something. You have to act normal tonight, like nothing's wrong, okay?" Sarah looked up at him with wide eyes, fear still etched on her face. "What do you mean, Dad?" "I'm going to be hiding," he said, his voice low, almost whispering. "I'll be right here, but you won't see me. If anything happens, I'll hear it. I'll know, and I'll come to help you. But I need you to trust me, okay?" Sarah hesitated, her eyes flicking nervously toward the hallway where Emily was. She nodded slowly. "I'm scared, but I trust you, Dad." "Good," he said, squeezing her hand. "Remember, if anything happens, use the code word. If you say whisper, I'll know you need me, and I'll be there. But until then, Stay calm, okay? Sarah nodded again, and with one last reassuring squeeze, Thomas turned and slipped into the living room. He headed straight for the closet, the dark, quiet space that would be his refuge tonight. As he closed the door behind him, the shadows seemed to stretch, engulfing him. The darkness in the closet felt like it was closing in, but Thomas didn't mind. He was used to the quiet. What he wasn't used to was the fear gnawing at his insides. What would he hear? What would he see? Minutes passed, the sound of Emily's laughter fading in the background. Then came the unmistakable sound of Sarah's voice, soft, hesitant. "Are you okay?" Emily's voice came next, dripping with false sweetness, but it was the edge in her tone that made Thomas's blood run cold. "You're not going to be difficult tonight, are you, Sarah?" A chill ran down his spine. The tension in his chest grew unbearable. He could hear Sarah's soft breathing, her words, her whispered plea, almost inaudible as she tried to make herself small, to disappear. And then came the unmistakable sound of a slap. The air in the closet grew thick, heavy. Thomas's fists clenched as he listened, waiting for the right moment to emerge. His daughter's voice trembled through the silence. "Whisper." In that instant, the door to the closet burst open. The next steps would be irreversible, but Thomas wasn't about to let anything stop him now. He stepped into the light, ready to confront the woman who had threatened everything he held dear. The air in the house was thick with the tension that had built over the last few hours. As Thomas stepped out of the closet, his breath caught in his throat. His heart pounded with a kind of primal rage, but there was something else. Something cold and calculated, a clarity that had been missing before. He wasn't just angry anymore. He was determined. He would protect his daughter at all costs. For a moment, everything seemed to slow down. He was in Sarah's room, her bed just a few feet away, but his focus was entirely on Emily. There she stood, just outside the door to Sarah's room, eyes wide with shock. She hadn't expected him to be there, hadn't thought he would catch her in the act. Emily was standing awkwardly, her hand halfway outstretched as though she had just been about to touch Sarah. Either to push her or to comfort her, Thomas couldn't be sure. But now her expression was one of frozen disbelief. The mask of sweetness and charm she'd worn for so long had cracked, revealing the anger underneath. "Thomas," she said, her voice trembling with a forced calm. "What are you doing here?" Thomas's voice was steady, but the words he spoke felt like they were clawing their way out of him, fueled by years of frustration and heartbreak. "I'm here to protect my daughter, Emily. From you." Her eyes widened, and for a split second, Thomas thought she might break down, beg for forgiveness, make some excuse. But the woman he had once loved, who had been so kind to him in the beginning, didn't flinch. Instead, her lips pressed into a tight, thin line. "Don't you dare accuse me of that," Emily hissed, her eyes flashing with anger now. "You have no idea what you're talking about. She's been lying to you, playing some kind of game. She's been trying to tear us apart from the beginning." Thomas took a step forward, his hand clenched into a fist. "I know what I saw, Emily. I know what I heard. You hurt her. You've been hurting her when I'm not around. And I'm not going to let that continue." For a moment, Emily's face faltered. Her lips parted, as if she was trying to think of something to say, something to save herself. But then she let out a bitter laugh, her voice mocking, almost derisive. "You really think she's innocent in all this? She's a little manipulator, Thomas. A brat. She's been making up stories to turn you against me. That's all this is. She's been trying to get rid of me from the start." Thomas felt a wave of nausea rise in his chest, but he pushed it down. He wasn't going to let her control the narrative anymore. Not after everything. Sarah's voice came from behind him, small and shaky. "Dad, please, don't listen to her." Thomas turned slowly to face his daughter. She was standing by the door now, her arms wrapped around her body, her face pale but determined. There was a tremble in her voice, But her words were clear. She wasn't backing down. She had told the truth, and she wasn't going to let Emily manipulate the situation any longer. "It's not a lie," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "She hurt me, Dad. I didn't make it up. You have to believe me." Thomas's heart broke as he looked at Sarah, his sweet, innocent daughter who had been forced to carry this secret for so long. She wasn't lying. Everything he had seen, everything he had heard, it was all true. "I believe you, Sarah," Thomas said softly. "I believe you." Emily's face turned red with fury, and she took a step towards Sarah, her hands balling into fists. "You're making a huge mistake, Thomas," she spat. "You have no idea what she's capable of. She's been trying to get rid of me for months. You don't know what she's really like, what she's been doing behind your back." But Thomas couldn't listen to her anymore. He stepped in between Emily and Sarah, shielding his daughter with his body, his voice a low growl. "Get out, now." Emily took a step back, her face twisted in disbelief. "You can't be serious." "I'm deadly serious," Thomas replied, his voice unwavering. "You've hurt my daughter. I'm not going to let you do it anymore. You need to leave. Now." For a long moment, Emily didn't move. Her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths as she glared at him, her eyes narrowing. She was calculating, searching for a way to twist the situation, to make him doubt his decision. But there was no more room for doubt. Not anymore. "You can't just throw me out like this," Emily said, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and desperation. "You don't even know what you're doing. You're ruining everything." "I'm protecting my daughter," Thomas said, his voice firm. "And that means you're out. Now." Emily opened her mouth to protest again, but the words caught in her throat. She stood there for a moment longer, her face a mask of fury and disbelief. Then, with one final, scathing look at Sarah, she turned on her heel and stormed out of the room. Thomas watched her go, feeling a strange mix of relief and guilt. He had kicked her out, but the finality of it stung. They had been a family once, but now there was nothing left of that. Just the shattered remnants of a relationship built on lies and manipulation. When Emily was gone, the house was quieter than it had been in days. Thomas turned to Sarah, his heart swelling with love and guilt. "Are you okay?" Sarah nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She looked fragile, like she might shatter at any moment. But there was a strength in her, too, a quiet resolve. She was safe now, and that was all that mattered. "I'm okay," Sarah whispered. "I'm just glad it's over. I don't want to be afraid anymore." Thomas pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. "You don't ever have to be afraid again, sweetheart. I promise you." For the first time in what felt like forever, Sarah's body relaxed against his. She wasn't tense, wasn't holding herself together with the brittle strength she had learned to develop over the past months. She was just his daughter, safe in his arms. Later that night, after they had eaten pizza, comfort food, a small but necessary gesture of normalcy, Thomas set to work. He changed the locks on the doors. He installed security cameras throughout the house. He even added an alarm system, something he had meant to do long ago but had pushed aside. He wasn't taking any chances anymore. He kept his word. He kept his promise to Sarah. He would never let her feel that fear again. As he sat in the living room later that night, staring at the quiet house around him, he felt a small sense of peace settle in his chest. But as he looked over at the empty chair where Emily had once sat, something darker tugged at him. The thought wouldn't leave his mind. Where would she go? What would she do? The doorbell rang the next morning, the sound unexpected and sharp. It startled Sarah, who was sitting at the kitchen table, flipping through her favorite book. Thomas's heart lurched as he opened the door. It was Emily. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with desperation. "Thomas, please," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "Just give me one more chance. Please. I'll change. I can fix things." I'm sorry. Please, don't do this. Thomas's heart twisted in his chest, but he didn't hesitate. He didn't flinch. I'm sorry, Emily. You've lost your chance. It's over. He closed the door without another word, and this time, he didn't feel a trace of doubt. He had done what he needed to do for his daughter, and that was all that mattered. He turned back to Sarah, his voice soft but firm. We're safe, sweetheart. You and me. And nothing is going to change that. And as they sat together, the quiet comfort of their new, secure life settling over them, Thomas knew one thing for sure. The future was theirs now, unbreakable, stronger than it had ever been.